The Second World War had just ended. Cities were in ruins, millions were dead, and two superpowers emerged from the ashes: the United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought side by side against Hitler, but the moment the war was over, they turned their eyes on each other. This wasn't a war of direct battles. It was a war of spies, of missiles, of ideology. A war where one wrong move could end civilization in fire. This was the Cold War. And today, we're diving into 10 dramatic events that shaped this global showdown. The Iron Curtain Speech, 1946. Imagine Europe in 1946. On one side, American troops, free elections, and rebuilding. On the other, Soviet tanks, communist governments, and fear. It was Winston Churchill who stood before an audience and declared, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Those words weren't just a warning. They were a line in the sand. The Cold War had found its name. The Berlin Airlift, 1948 to 49. Berlin, the heart of Germany, was divided. The Soviets tried to choke off West Berlin by cutting roads, railways, and canals. Imagine a city of 2 million people with no food, no fuel, no escape. What did the Allies do? They took to the skies. For almost a year, American and British planes flew in supplies every single day. Over 270,000 flights. One plane landed every 30 seconds. Children in Berlin waited at airfields for pilots to drop candy tied to handkerchiefs. It was defiance in its purest form, and it told Stalin, "We're not leaving." The Korean War, 1950 to 53. Then, the Cold War turned hot. In 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviets, stormed across the 38th parallel to unite the peninsula by force. The US and United Nations fought back. China poured in hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The battles were savage. Frozen mountains, relentless artillery, human wave attacks. By the end, millions were dead, and the map of Korea looked almost the same as it did before. But the world had learned a terrifying lesson. The Cold War could erupt into real war at any time. The Cuban Revolution and Bay of Pigs, 1959 to 61. Now picture this. Only 90 miles from Florida, Fidel Castro seizes power in Cuba and declares his loyalty to Moscow. The US is horrified. Communism has arrived in America's backyard. In 1961, Washington backs a secret invasion. Cuban exiles storm the beaches at the Bay of Pigs, and it's a disaster. Captured, humiliated, the US looks weak. And Castro? He runs straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. This failure would set the stage for the deadliest standoff of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. October 1962. American spy planes spot Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from US shores. President Kennedy orders a naval blockade. Soviet ships steam toward Cuba. For 13 days, the world holds its breath. Was this it? The beginning of World War III? In the end, Moscow agreed to withdraw its missiles, while Washington secretly removed its nukes from Turkey. The crisis ended, but not without leaving a permanent scar. The Cold War had nearly ended the world. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. If Korea was a stalemate, Vietnam was a quagmire. For 2 decades, the US poured men, money, and machines into a jungle war they could not win. Helicopters whirring over rice paddies, villages caught in crossfire, napalm burning the earth, and back home, protests filled American streets. By the time the last helicopter lifted off from Saigon in 1975, communism had spread, and the world saw the United States stumble. It was the costliest Cold War wound for America. The space race, 1957 to 1969. But while jungles burned on Earth, the Cold War also stretched into the stars. In 1957, a simple beep beep shocked the world. The Soviets had launched Sputnik, the first satellite. 2 years later, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. The US panicked. If the Soviets could launch satellites, could they also launch nuclear weapons from orbit? The race was on. Billions of dollars, cutting-edge technology, and national pride went into rockets. And in 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. It wasn't just a victory for science. It was a message. The United States had won the heavens. The Prague Spring, 1968. Back in Europe, hope briefly bloomed. In Czechoslovakia, leaders tried to loosen Soviet control, allowing free speech and reforms. Crowds filled the streets with excitement. Socialism with a human face, they called it. But Moscow wasn't having it. In August 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Prague. Soldiers crushed the uprising. It was a bitter reminder. Behind the Iron Curtain, freedom would be met with force. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. The Cold War's final battleground came in the mountains of Afghanistan. When the Soviets invaded in 1979, they expected a quick victory. Instead, they were bogged down in a brutal guerrilla war. The U.S. armed Afghan fighters with missiles and guns, turning the conflict into Moscow's own Vietnam. 10 years later, the Soviets limped home, defeated. The empire was bleeding. Its days were numbered. The fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989. And then, the symbol of the Cold War came crashing down. On a November night in 1989, crowds of East Germans gathered at the Berlin Wall. They climbed it, smashed it, danced on it. Families separated for decades embraced. The wall that had divided the world's most dangerous city was gone. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The Cold War was over. For nearly half a century, the Cold War kept the world in suspense. A chess match played with tanks, bombs, and spies. At times, humanity came within inches of annihilation. At others, it reached for the stars. These 10 events weren't just milestones. They were turning points that defined an entire era. So here's my question to you. Which Cold War moment do you think truly changed the world forever? Was it Cuba, when we came closest to nuclear war? Or was it the fall of the Berlin Wall, when hope finally triumphed? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to subscribe, because this is just one chapter in the endless story of our past. Thanks for watching.